Hello, Embracers, and welcome to another episode of Embracing Autism IRL. Today, I welcome Chloe Cullen of the social media page Autistic Truth. With over 22,000 followers, Chloe has made a splash in the online world. She describes herself as an autistic adult who enjoys volunteering in her local community, where she is often found campaigning for better support services for autistic individuals and strives toward improving autism-related services. Hi, Chloe. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey.
I just want to start off with learning a little bit more about who you are. So could you just tell me what makes Chloe Chloe and what are your passions?
Well, what makes me me is I want to help change things so other autistic people don't go through what I went through as a child growing up as an autistic person, and to make sure that others don't get misdiagnosed and go undiagnosed like I did as a child.
And could you tell me just briefly, just to get to know you, are there any particular hobbies that you enjoy or any special interests?
I think my hobby mostly is actually volunteering and the campaign work that I do and trying to improve services. I think I put everything into it, if that makes sense. It's something that I enjoy doing, making a difference, and it consumes most of my time. Because obviously I'm chronically sick as well. I can't really do too much, so I'm either doing campaign work or resting.
I can totally relate to that. It's kind of like once you learn about autism in yourself, you kind of get really passionate about trying to help other people. So, one of the things that I have learned about growing up for myself before I even knew I was autistic, because I didn't get my diagnosis until adulthood, was that being different essentially really attracted bullies when it came to when I was growing up. And I was wondering if you perhaps experienced any bullying either growing up or through adulthood, or have you had any experience with bullying due to your autism?
Well, definitely, especially when I was younger, I went through a lot of bullying. For some reason, children have this weird sense of being able to pick up on kids that are different and kids that are more vulnerable. So they, even though I didn't have a diagnosis back then, they always knew there was something a little bit different about me and knew to target me for some reason. And I get targeted online as well, being openly autistic, which isn't great.
Can you share, or are you comfortable sharing some examples of the bullying you've endured?
Well, the bullying I endure online is I get people accuse me of not being diagnosed autistic, and people accusing me of faking being autistic when I'm not, because I was medically diagnosed back in 2016. And my autism was first picked up when I was a child, but I didn't get diagnosed as a child because I had a sister that was terminally sick. She has cystic fibrosis. So all the focus was put onto my sister being sick, and the doctors and the professionals made excuses for my struggles and made out that I was just attention seeking and that my difficulties and behavior was due to my sister being sick. But they sent me to a special needs play school and sent me to years of speech therapy, but they wouldn't diagnose me or assess me. But a lot of the bullying I get online is people trying to dismiss that I am diagnosed, and even when I try to show proof of my diagnosis, they just dismiss it.
Do you mind sharing kind of your personal experience with that? Like, for me, I know that if I was dismissed, it would definitely make me feel really frustrated. And I mean, honestly, it could kind of make you feel kind of like imposter syndrome, because if you do have a formal diagnosis and I know that for me, when I got my formal diagnosis, even though I had that piece of paper, I was still kind of questioning it because it's hard to kind of process that emotionally. But how's that experience been for you? Do you experience imposter syndrome? Does the bullying that you experience impact you in any way?
It does impact me quite a lot mentally. I have carers that look after me. They come in 5 days a week and they come in to take care of me because I'm not capable of living on my own. So a lot of the time my carers have more work to do because I get quite distressed sometimes. I find it hard because I never chose to seek a diagnosis. I never wanted to be diagnosed. I got admitted into a psychiatric hospital to be treated for an eating disorder. And the psychiatrist in the hospital, he picked up on the fact that I was autistic. And when I was medically and mentally better, he decided to assess me for autism, and I got diagnosed with autistic. And it took me a really, really long time to accept that diagnosis. And it took a lot of processing. And if it wasn't for the actually autistic hashtag on Twitter, I wouldn't have got through it because there was no support after my diagnosis. And the only people that reached out was people from a hashtag online who helped me process my diagnosis and helped me understand myself better. And having somebody dismiss my diagnosis and that I'm autistic and accuse me of lying after going through so much processing and trying to accept my diagnosis, it's very triggering for me because it takes me back to that moment where I was struggling to accept my diagnosis and I was extremely suicidal, and I thought that I didn't have a future being diagnosed autistic, and I thought that my life was over. So it just takes me back to that moment where I was having to process all of that horrible stuff, and it's just a lot to have to try and manage, especially as an autistic person, when your emotions are heightened and you struggle to understand things and process things. It's an extra layer of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I can only imagine. I mean, with my own diagnosis, I struggled a lot growing up, but I at least was able to receive my other diagnoses of ADHD in like high school. So that kind of helped a little bit. But you mentioned that actually autistic hashtag. For me personally, in my experience, I have seen the negative side of that hashtag in the regard of seeing a lot of like parents and such kind of attacked by a lot of people who use that. So I can see why people are sensitive around the use of that hashtag. But can you share your perspective of what actually autistic means to you and why you actually embrace that?
I think with every hashtag, every community, there's good people in it and bad people in it. And a lot of the time, people tend to focus on more of the bads than the goods. And this hashtag has been something that has saved my life, and it's helped quite a lot of other autistic people and saved our lives. It's helped us connect with other autistic people. We're able to view posts by other autistic people who are going through similar situations. We can ask each other questions, we can support each other, and we can help each other through things just together, and we can talk about things openly. And it just gives a sense of community and support that I didn't have because there wasn't any support after I got diagnosed autistic. But yes, I have come across some issues with people who use the hashtag, but there's also many, 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 many people who use the hashtag who are lovely, kind, helpful. I just think that there's just a few who decide to try to ruin things for the rest of everybody else, and it gives the whole hashtag a bad name, which you can't. It's like saying a community, because a few people in a community say, like, I don't know, say like I live in a small village, say if there's a few people in that small village who are known for doing criminal stuff or bad things, and that whole village being labeled as a criminal village, it's not really fair on everybody else to then get that label of, oh, you must be a bad person because you use that hashtag. It's like everybody discriminates against everybody who uses the hashtag and thinks that we're all like that, and it's a bit unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I haven't really thought about it from that perspective. For me, I'm an autistic adult, but I'm also a parent to two autistic kids, and I experienced interactions with that hashtag before I had my diagnosis. And because I didn't have my diagnosis, I got a lot of the attacks for being like an autism mom. And it's almost like I had to have my diagnosis for them to treat me kindly before. But I get what you're saying. Like, it's not 100% all one way or another. And I think that bad experiences do stand out more than positive experiences. They tend to make a bigger impact. So it might be that we're only paying attention to those who use it, who do something negative, and we're not really remembering or paying attention to the people who use the hashtag who are actually doing positive things. I think that's a valid point. I know me personally, I have not paid attention to the ones who are doing positive things. So it's very likely that that is the case. I wanted to ask you too, because you mentioned before on, I believe, your Facebook, is it Facebook that you have the Autistic Truth page, or is it across a
Yeah,
variety of social media?
I have it on Facebook and Twitter.
Okay.
So I have
So
Autistic Truth Facebook and Twitter.
Okay. So I think one of the things that you talk about is called the double empathy problem. Could you explain to me what that means?
Well, I think a lot of the issue that comes with parents of autistic kids and autistic people themselves can be contributed to the double empathy problem. The double empathy problem is, think of it like a language barrier. You go on holiday to somewhere and there's a different culture, different language, and you struggle to communicate with the people there and they struggle to communicate with you because you don't speak the same language and you don't have the same culture. So for autistic people trying to communicate with neurotypical people, we don't understand how neurotypical people think. We don't understand how neurotypical people feel as much. Same as neurotypical people may not understand autistic people's sensory struggles. They might not understand the way that we think. Like, for example, autistic people, we tend not to read between the lines of things, if that makes sense. And we tend to not focus on tone of voice, body language, facial expressions, or some of us. And then there's neurotypical people who, when they see a facial expression, they automatically assume somebody's mad, or they hear a certain tone of voice and they assume something. And often that's what happens. Is what I come across online is people will wrongly assume my tone of voice when I don't understand how you can use a tone of voice when you're typing, because I don't use a tone of voice much anyway, but using a tone of voice when you're typing online, I'm just like, how can anybody have a tone of voice when you're doing text? And
Yeah.
people just
No,
seem to make assumptions about it, and they just seem to jump to big conclusions, and then people get mad really quick on the internet, and it's very hard. And I think the other barrier is, when you're talking to somebody on the internet, it's much more harder than when you're talking to someone face to face, because when you're face to face, you're less likely to say half the stuff that you're likely to say over the internet. So often emotions get heated, then because there's two people who aren't understanding each other, that then ends up in some sort of conflict and some sort of fight, which isn't helpful. But there is some neurotypical people, because I've helped quite a lot of parents of autistic kids, and I've had some great communication with some neurotypical parents of autistic kids. And it's always the parents who don't assume my tone of voice. They listen and they really want to listen and learn. They don't wrongly assume things. They don't jump to conclusions. They don't read between the lines. And they don't get really defensive when I say something, or if they don't understand me, they'll ask and clarify. Whereas it's always the people who don't do any of that that I have issues with. And that's where the communication often is.
it's so funny that you say that, because when I got my autism diagnosis, one of the questions that they asked is, do you have any pet peeves? And if so, what it is? And mine was when people make assumptions. I was like, I hate that people make assumptions, because I've fallen into that trap too, where people assume all the time what I say or mean, and it's like wrong 99% of the time. And it's so frustrating because we know what we're trying to say, and it just seems like we are speaking a different language, and it just comes off a completely different way. And then on the internet, you are like struggling to try to get that point across, and it's like every time you try to fix it with another message, it just makes it worse and worse. I can totally relate to that.
It's why I think there's often a lot of conflict with autistic people and parents online, because a lot of the time autistic people, we are fed up with repeating ourselves and getting our heads bitten off, and getting bullied online, because we also get bullied by autistic parents online quite a lot. I've experienced quite a lot of bullying, and people accusing me of not being autistic, or people accusing random stuff and accusing me of being a bully when I've not bullied anybody, which is really confusing. But I think the whole issue is just the fact of the miscommunication and all of that stuff, as well as just autistic people. We're fed up of being bullied, and we're fed up of being misinterpreted, people judging us wrongly, as well as, I think the other issue is there's parents of autistic kids who are feeling like they've been judged, they're not being listened to, and that they're frustrated because of what they're having to go through with their autistic child. They're having to fight. And then they see autistic adults like us, and then because we're trying to tell them something and trying to help them in a way that somebody like their doctor may be saying something different, they may get angry at us because we say, oh, well, this helped for us. And then they're like, but, well, our doctor says this. And then another autistic person may say, well, this was harmful for me. And then a parent may not agree with that. And then they get defensive, because if an autistic parent says, oh, this therapy harmed me and has harmed many of my friends, then a parent can get really angry at us when we're just trying to explain our experiences. We're just trying to explain what we went through, what we've experienced, so that we can help other autistic people not go through what we went through. And I think sometimes parents misinterpret that as us trying to be controlling, bullying, and be nasty, or just being negative, when we're not, or trying to blame them for harming their child. And I get why parents are defensive that when it comes to their children or them being harmed, but we're not trying to blame parents for harming their children. I think what autistic people just want to do so desperately is we want to protect other autistic people going through what we went through. And because we have a lot of trauma from what we went through, sometimes the way we communicate things across to neurotypical people doesn't come across in a way that we want it to come across. And we can get very emotional and very upset about it. And sometimes it can come across like we're angry at them when we're not necessarily angry at them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think I've seen some of that, and I think that due to the nature of autism, communication is one of the biggest challenges. And so, how you come off to somebody can be a challenge. I know I personally have struggled with that all the time. I've gotten a bad reputation without intending to because my tone is off. I think one of the things that I've seen, though, from like the side and perspective of also being a parent, because again, I've been able to be on both sides of that coin, is I've seen some autistic adults using that hashtag, for instance, that actually go to the extent of like calling social services on parents to get their kids removed from their home because they put their kids in ABA therapy, for instance, or going to the extent of trying to dox them to their job to try to get them fired and telling them that, oh, this person is abusing their child. And so because they blow up that employer's place, they, well, blow up their social media with a bunch of information is what I mean, not a literal violence, but they end up losing their jobs, or they end up having the cops show up at their house, the police. And I think that in those instances, it leaves like kind of like the scar on the parenting community where, again, they remember the negative. So they'll remember that. And that is what ends up being kind of spread through social media, that people will associate with the actually autistic community or autistic adults. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, so it seems like there's like good intentions there. What do you think could potentially be a solution to this communication barrier that you're describing? Because it seems like there's definitely positive intent behind it, but I think that that message is getting lost. And I'm wondering, do you have any potential solutions to how you think that communication could be delivered more effectively to parents, or vice versa? Are parents not communicating effectively with the autistic community?
I just want to say something quickly. Some autistic parents I know, they had social services being called on them by neurotypical parents from like the other community of parents of autistic kids. It's been several autistic parents I've known of who have had parents call on them, call social services on them, and even dox them online and try to get their businesses destroyed, their social media taken down. I think the I think there's issues on both sides. I don't think either side is innocent in that situation. I think both have issues and both do the exact same thing to a certain extent. I think there's not much understanding in what which each side is doing, because I've had some friends who have been doxxed quite badly. I've had some friends who have had their children targeted. I've had some friends who have had their businesses, their social services have been called on their businesses, organizations, social services have been called on them, their schools have been informed. It's just so much that's gone on. It's not just autistic people are doing that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes
But
sense. I think it's
but
horrible on both sides.
I think the issue is like one side thinks that it's just one side doing it when it's not. It happens on both sides, and I know that it happens on both sides of things between parents of autistic people and autistic people themselves. I think the whole issue is you get radical people on both sides of the net. Basically, you get parents who take it too far, and you get autistic people who take it too far. And I don't think either side is innocent in any situation. But I just think that each side has a bad rep. Fair enough. But I just don't think it's fair to think that one side is doing it more than the other, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I wasn't aware of that side. It doesn't really get communicated or expressed as much online, so I'm just going from what I've seen
It's
myself.
because when you're in a community, you're in more like an echo chamber. So you're mostly hearing things that people want you to hear, that you're not hearing things that people don't want you to hear. So I think that's the issue that is in both sides of things, basically, because in the autistic community we hear things that only we talk about, whereas in the parents community they hear things mostly they talk about, and you don't really hear about things from both points of view. And that's where the whole disconnect between things is pretty messy. And that's where the issue is, mostly.
So what do you think can be done to kind of like bridge that gap? I don't know from your experience if you feel like at least the people that you've talked to would be willing to have these conversations in like a kind of like passive way. I know like both sides can get really defensive, and when people get defensive, there's like a breakdown of communication, so it makes it really hard. I'm hoping that people can have a conversation just like you and I are right now and just honestly discuss the topic without getting heated, but realistically, I'm not sure.
I think it's more of a case of having more open conversations like this, as well as recognizing faults on both sides, as well as also I think it needs to be a lot of the focus is on how autistic people communicate and how we need to change our communication ways and how we need to come across better, which I think there needs to be a bit more emphasis on how neurotypical people try and meet autistic people halfway and learn how we communicate and stop making assumptions about tone of voice, stop making assumptions about facial expressions, and stop assuming that we're not diagnosed as well, because that's one that pisses me off a little bit. I'm not if am I allowed to say that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's fine. No, you're fine. Yeah, no, that's true.
Basically, it's very, very difficult because in my experience, parents of autistic kids, they've tried to dismiss that I'm autistic to try and dismiss and discredit what I say and to try and silence me. And that's what's happening a lot to autistic people I know is the one thing people throw around most is, oh, you're self-diagnosed, you're photistic, you're a fraud, you're a scammer, you're a grifter. When these people don't know us, they don't know if we're diagnosed or not. They weren't there when we were children. They don't know how autistic we are. They don't know our lives. They don't know us personally. And I've personally had a fundraiser online of mine targeted by one parent of an autistic child and accused me of being a scammer and a fraud and basically tried to destroy my fundraiser and my whole reputation. And it was really, really difficult for me because I desperately needed an electric wheelchair because I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome and I've had 3 knee
Mm.
surgeries and I need a knee replacement. And in the UK, the NHS doesn't give out electric wheelchairs to people who can walk a short distance. And I can't propel myself in a wheelchair because my shoulder sublux and my heart condition, it irritates my heart condition. So I can't propel myself in a wheelchair. So I had to save up and fundraise for an electric wheelchair, which obviously, as you know, costs quite a lot. So for a parent of an autistic child to come and destroy my fundraiser and make out that I was a fraud and try to destroy my reputation and accuse me of being a scammer, that was really, really triggering for me because I was already going through complete hell as it was with my physical health, and it was something that I didn't need in that moment of time. And all I wanted was just to have my mobility back, to be able to see my friends, hang out with my friends more, and just to have my life back because I can barely go out because I can't go out because at the moment I don't have a wheelchair hoist in my car to put my wheelchair in and out. So I haven't been able to see my friends properly in about 2 or so years. I haven't been able to go out to the city and meet up with them. And for somebody to then try to destroy a fundraiser where I was trying to progress to be able to not be so isolated at home, it was hard for me because I was already in a really suicidal state. And I think a lot of parents don't understand that we are humans. Like the autistic people you're communicating with online, we are humans. We actually are autistic people. We are going through our own battles. We're struggling, and autistic people, we have an extremely high suicide rate. Autistic women statistically are 13 times more likely to die by suicide. Autistic people in general, they're 9 times more likely to die by suicide. And I've been sectioned in and out of psychiatric hospital many times due to me not having my autism supported and being suicidal. And I think people forget at how vulnerable autistic people are. And I think there's an uneven balance of how autistic people are treated, and people aren't understanding how severely it can impact us and how it can end up resulting in us losing our lives. Because
So in your
I've had a friend who's been targeted online for nearly 4 years now, by parents of autistic kids.
in your ideal world, what would you like to see? Like what is your idea of support? What would you hope to see?
What I would hope to see is, what do you mean, support from parents or support in general?
Yeah, I would say from the parents because right now from my audience is parents, so they're the ones that are going to be listening to this.
What I'd like parents to do is just be a bit more understanding in the ways autistic people communicate, understand that the way we communicate can sometimes be rooted in trauma due to the things that we went through. A lot of us haven't had the opportunities that other autistic kids have had, that your autistic kids may have, that other autistic kids haven't had. Some of us have been late diagnosed. We've been blamed for all of our struggles. Some of us have been through harmful therapies, harmful treatments. Some people I know have been through electric shock treatments. Some people I've known have been in abusive institutions. Like, there's a lot that we've been through that I think parents need to understand is that when we're communicating, yes, we may be emotional. Yes, we may be overly sensitive. Yes, we may come across harsh, but it might not technically be that we're coming across harsh. It might just be because we're emotional and because of the way that we communicate. Because a lot of the time we are matter of fact about things. We don't beat around the bush. We don't use lots of big words and stuff. We just very direct. And because we're direct, people assume that we are being rude. We are trying to upset people when we're not. I think people just need to understand that we communicate differently, to meet us halfway and to speak to us like we would any autistic person, and try to understand that we may have difficulty communicating what we want to communicate across, and that we may get frustrated. Like, any autistic person may get frustrated. We may have a meltdown, and maybe that meltdown that we're having may come across in the way that we're communicating with you. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Like,
that
say,
makes
for
sense.
example, I say, for example, I'm speaking to a parent and say they're not understanding me, and I'm trying to explain to them, but they're misunderstanding me every single time I go, and I start getting really distressed. So I start getting angry and I start getting frustrated, but I'm not getting angry at them. I'm getting more frustrated at the fact that I'm being misunderstood. And I think a lot of the time people kind of make out like we're being bullies or angry people just because we're having a little bit of a meltdown and we're getting distressed. And I think if parents understood that a little bit more, and they understood that this is what I need to say. The other misconception is that everybody who uses the actually autistic hashtag is self-diagnosed. That's what people keep spreading around online. It is not true. Not true at all. Just because a lot of us, we support self-diagnosis. The only reason we support self-diagnosis is because the diagnostic process for females and Black, Indigenous people of colour is very biased and unfair, because the whole diagnostic test for autism is based on white males. The whole research over years and years is spanned out, is mostly done on white males. So the autism diagnostic test is mostly done on how white males present. They don't include how autistic people from different cultures may present. And they don't include how females may present a bit differently as autistic. So it's very hard for us to get diagnosed. And often we'll get misdiagnosed with personality disorders, we'll get misdiagnosed with ADHD, anxiety disorders, and other mental health conditions. So the only reason a lot of the autistic community supports self-diagnosis is on the basis that the diagnosis process at the moment is unfair, it's biased, it's not accurate, and it's very hard to get assessed correctly as autistic. And many people are ending up late diagnosed because we were missed as children because of how biased autism education has been over the years. Like back when I was a child, it was very, very rare for a girl to get diagnosed. We're talking in the 90s. It was very rare for an autistic girl, well, a girl who's autistic, to get diagnosed. We're more likely to get brushed aside and just said, oh, it's probably anxiety or something like that, or they'll find something else to blame it on, like they did with me. So I think we just need to be understanding that not everybody is self-diagnosed who uses the hashtag, because I'm diagnosed. There's literally hundreds of people I know who are diagnosed medically who use the hashtag. And just because there's a few who use it who are self-diagnosed doesn't mean everybody's self-diagnosed. And just because we support self-diagnosis doesn't mean that everybody who uses the hashtag is self-diagnosed. And I think that's where a lot of the issue is where people like me get accused of being self-diagnosed, because they assume because we use a hashtag that we're all self-diagnosed. Because there's people who are anti-neurodiversity, and they like to spread misinformation about basically making out that we're all self-diagnosed, and they believe that autistic people cannot be diagnosed late in life.
Well, I was diagnosed late. I got diagnosed like a year ago, officially. And I'm 34 now, so I was 33 when that happened. So yeah, I get that.
No, I was diagnosed when I was 20, but my autism was spotted when I was a baby by my mum. So I couldn't be held when I was a baby. She had to prop me up in the corner of the sofa to give me my bottle, and I would elope, I'd run away. She had to have this leash sort of thing on me when I was little.
Yeah, I use those for my kids.
I almost jumped off a cliff because I had no awareness of danger at all. And we went to Dover, which is down south, and not Dover, I think it was Devon actually. And there was cliffs, and me being me, I had no awareness of danger. I'd run into roads, I'd run almost off cliffs. I kept jumping into a swimming pool once with one of those swimming rings on that you put your legs through, and it's got a little bit that you sit in. I kept jumping in head first and getting stuck. My mum would
that sounds like my kids.
My mum would pull me back out. I'd have a meltdown, and then I'd go back and do it again.
Yep.
Because I forget I'd just done it. And it just didn't make sense. And my mum tried for years to try and get me assessed and diagnosed. But they just kept saying to my mum, oh, you've got one child with a disability. You don't need another. That's what they told my mum. when I was younger.
Wow.
Yeah, that was good old CAMS for you, Child Adolescent Mental Health Services. They tried to dismiss all of my struggles and blame it on the fact that my sister was sick. But
So
I
let me
just
ask
think,
you a question. Oh, sorry. I was just going to ask you a question about the self-diagnosis. Some people make the argument of basically why not just rephrase it? So, like, instead of saying self-diagnosis, just say like suspected autistic. Because from what I've heard, most people are actually okay with somebody claiming that they suspect that they're autistic. And the issue that people tend to have with self-diagnosis is essentially claiming the diagnosis part without actually having gone through the process. So do you see any difference between the two of those phrases, autistic, like suspected autistic versus self-diagnosed?
not really, because most people I know who have been self-diagnosed went on to get an actual diagnosis. So considering that most autistic people who do self-diagnose to start with, that they do end up going on to actually getting diagnosed, I don't really think it makes much of a difference. Because the thing is you're born autistic, you don't suddenly become autistic when you're diagnosed. And I think that's where a lot of the issue is like people think, oh, you can only be autistic once you get diagnosed autistic. No, you were born into a world as an autistic person. You don't suddenly just become autistic when you're diagnosed. But
Yeah.
yes, there may be some people who may have got the self-diagnosis wrong, who may instead be ADHD instead, rather than autistic. But they'll then find that out when they do go through the diagnosis process. But the problem is there's some who do not have the privilege of going through the diagnosis process, especially if you're in a country where you have to pay for diagnosis. So I don't like, I agree with self-diagnosis, but I don't agree with people self-diagnosing based off a few symptoms, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I
So
think one of
as long as they really researched it, which most of the people I know who are self-diagnosed have, most people I know who are self-diagnosed, they've researched it to literal death. I mean, they go beyond research. It gets a bit ridiculous how much they do research it, but they research it for a reason to make sure that the self-diagnosis is correct. But any person who's self-diagnosed, they need to make sure that they do self-diagnose correct, and they do the extensive research that all of my friends who have self-diagnosed have done, because yeah, the amount that they've done was a lot. And
yeah, I can
if you make sure that you've done the research, you've talked to your family, your friends, and you spoke to them about the possibility of being autistic, and if they sort of like a bit like, yeah, that makes sense, then you were probably along the right path.
I could definitely relate to that because I did a ton of research. I submitted like I think it was like a 14-page single space document of all the things that I thought. Um, but one of the things that I hear though is like when it comes to self-diagnosis, some people who may not actually be autistic, who claim the diagnosis essentially, may ultimately end up speaking over the voices of people who are actually diagnosed. And because of that, the entire neurodiversity movement could essentially move the wrong way by listening to those voices rather than those who are diagnosed when they're at odds. So I'm wondering what are your thoughts on that situation? Like if we have people who are actually like legitimately diagnosed and then we have the self-diagnosis and they have two opinions that are polar opposite and the medical field has to decide which one to go with, what would you say in that scenario, I guess, would be proper? Like how would we then address the situation like that?
If I'm honest, I think there's very few who self-diagnose who know they're not actually autistic. I think there's very few who self-diagnose for the wrong reasons. Like there has been a few who have self-diagnosed on TikTok who claim that they're autistic, and they've been called out and they've admitted that they weren't autistic, and they admitted that they were lying. But there's very few of them compared to those who are actual genuine. I think the problem is people get wrapped up in the few who do wrong, and they make out that that few is probably a bigger proportion of people when it's not. So I think a lot of the self-diagnosed people I know, they are genuine, and in my opinion, they are autistic, knowing them personally. But there are a small minority who aren't autistic, who do it for God knows what reasons. But a lot of autistic people end up calling them out anyway, and they end up getting found out eventually, or they end up admitting it. But I don't support people trying to self-diagnose with autism just for online views and money or any social media clout or whatever. If you're, as long as you're self-diagnosing for the right reasons and you truly suspect you're autistic and you've done the research and you are genuine about it, then I have no problems with it. But if you're self-diagnosing for the wrong reasons, to get attention, to speak over people who are genuinely autistic, then that's not okay. And
Okay, that makes sense.
I never try to speak over other people much unless I'm trying to stick up for somebody, if that makes sense. If I know
Yeah.
somebody is saying something harmful, then I'm going to speak over them, if that makes sense, and correct them. But if somebody is like just saying whatever, I'm not going to speak over them, but is what it is. But
No, I
I
mean, that
don't know.
makes sense. It's kind of just taking care of the people you care about. I get it.
Yeah,
So,
I just don't like the fact that a lot of people, they have this assumption that loads of people who self-diagnose, they're just doing it for online media attention, and they assume that people are just self-diagnosing for the fun of it, for online internet attention, for clout, for money, for donations, and all of that, which isn't true, because I haven't earned a penny from Facebook. I haven't earned a penny from Twitter. I have a Ko-fi page, but I haven't earned much for that. That was just for fundraising for my wheelchair, and all the proceeds of that went to my wheelchair. So like, we don't, like, a lot of people I know, they don't do it. They don't really gain anything from it. None of us gain anything from saying, "Oh, we're autistic." All we gain really is talking from people in the community, in the autistic community, making friends and getting support from each other. That's all we really gain from saying that we're autistic. If we self-diagnose, you don't really gain anything. You don't gain a formal diagnosis from it. You can't gain any therapies or treatment or help. And this is where I get confused, is people say, "Oh, those who self-diagnose, they're taking therapies away from people." And I'm like, huh? I'm like, if you self-diagnose, how can you take therapies away from somebody? Because I'm diagnosed autistic and there's no therapies, there's no support for people like me. So how can people who self-diagnose take away any support when people like me can't even get any support? Like, for me to get
honestly,
support, I had to literally almost lose my life, end up sectioned in hospital, and deteriorate mentally really badly, just to be able to get the support I get now, for them to realize, oh yeah, she's not as high functioning as we think she is.
yeah. Honestly, I've seen within the parent community, I've even seen parents who get upset with parents who have like level 1 high functioning autistic kids. They get upset with those parents saying that their children are taking support and resources away from their level 2, level 3 autistic kid. So even within their own community, I've seen that. I've personally been a target to that, even though my kids actually ended up being level 2 and 3. But still, it's definitely something that's prevalent, and I do feel like it's unnecessary. Everybody should kind of be in the same boat and just all have an equal goal of trying to support the autistic community in general as a whole together.
Exactly.
Um,
I think all autistic people, we deserve support. And the fact is in my country where I live in the UK, autistic people, we have an extremely high rate of suicide. And a lot of autistic people I know, mostly female autistic people, end up locked up in psychiatric units, and many of my friends have sadly passed away because of this. There's a high rate of autistic people who are locked up in the UK, and the reason is because there's no community services for us to be able to be released into the community. There's no help for us, because autism services in the UK will only support autistic people if you've got a severe learning disability alongside your autism. And if you're just autistic, you don't get the support. And the problem is mental health services in the UK, they're not equipped to support and treat autistic people long term. They can't help us with our daily needs, and they don't understand how to support us. They can help us with our mental health, but they can't really help us with our mental health, because often our mental health is wrapped up in to do with our autism and our autistic needs not being met. So if our needs aren't being met autism wise, then our mental health's going to deteriorate. And if we're not being treated as a whole, as our mental health and our autism, then we're not going to get better. We're not going to get the support we need. And the problem is, that's why a lot of people where I live sadly lose their life. I had a friend back last year in August. She begged and begged and begged mental health services to basically help her because her friend died, and she begged services to help her, and she jumped off the bridge.
I'm so
And
sorry.
I ended up having to find out that she was in intensive care. So it was very hard for me to find out that my friend was in intensive care and she almost died. And this was the second closest friend I've had to jump off a bridge in the space of 2 months. And the problem is because there's no support for autistic people like me. And the thing is, the fact that people get angry at us thinking that we're taking away support services upsets me, because there's no support for us. If there was support for us, we wouldn't be dying the way that we're dying. And there's so many autistic people I know who have died because there's not support. And we get bullied online so much, which contributes to everything. And people don't realize how much of a toll it takes on us. People think because we have social media platforms that we must be really high functioning, but people don't understand that functioning level is not concrete, because one day I can function well and another day I can barely function. I can barely do anything. Say if like there's a lot of noise going out, like the neighbors mowing the lawn, or there's a lot of sirens because I live next door to a fire station, or say like it's a really hot day and I'm really overwhelmed and there's a lot of sensory wise things going on and I'm really overwhelmed, I wouldn't be able to barely function at all. And I have a lot of meltdowns sometimes. Like, people look at me and they think that I can't be less autistic because I can speak in a certain way, I come across in a certain way, but people don't see me when I'm having a meltdown, because I can hold my meltdowns in most of the time until I'm in private. Like, I've been with my boyfriend for 2 years, and he saw me have a meltdown for the first time a few weeks ago, and I'm surprised he didn't run, but no, he was okay. He stayed. He's autistic too, so he understood.
Can I ask you something, Chloe? So we're going to be wrapping up this episode real quick, but I want to make sure that I ask you something because, again, my audience who will be listening to this are mostly parents of autistic kids. And you've done a beautiful job of explaining, expressing what it's like to be an autistic adult with all these struggles. I wonder if you have any sort of like advice or any sort of recommendation for these parents, because they might be listening to this episode and be worried, like, is this going to happen to my kid? Are they going to be, very like struggling with their own autism or struggling with the lack of supports? Like, what do you think you can tell these parents? What do you wish your parents had known, or what support do you wish you had had from your parents?
Well, the main thing I wish I knew, I wish I knew I was autistic earlier in life. And I know that some parents keep their child's diagnosis from them. And I do think that's a bit dangerous, keeping your child's diagnosis from them, because there's some autistic people I know who haven't found out they were autistic until they were in their 30s. And they found out they were diagnosed as children because their parents didn't want to tell them they were autistic, because they thought if they told them that they were autistic, then they wouldn't succeed in life. But I think knowing that you're autistic can be a strength, because you can then work on your sensory struggles, you can work on your communication difficulties, you can work on trying to manage your emotions better, and you can try to understand yourself better. You can reach out to people who are going through something similar, and you can form bonds and networks and make friends with people who like you, and so that you feel less alone. Because when I was younger, I literally felt like I was an alien and I was placed on the completely wrong planet. I just felt like I
Yeah.
couldn't communicate with anybody else. Nobody understood me and I couldn't understand them. So I remember being suicidal and wishing I wasn't alive from a really young age. And we're talking about 7 years old. And I knew why I was different back then, maybe my mental health wouldn't have deteriorated so badly. And maybe if I was able to connect and communicate and make friends with autistic people who were like me when I was younger, maybe I would have felt less alone. Maybe I would have done a lot more better in life, just knowing I'm autistic, having friends who are autistic who are like me, and just having people around me who understood me better and people who didn't blame me for being the way that I was, because a lot of my struggles was blamed on me and I was expected. A lot of the teachers at school, they treated me like a neurotypical person, and I was often in trouble a lot because I couldn't cope in class because I would hear everything. I could hear electricity running through the walls. I could hear people talking in the classroom next door. I could hear people's legs shuffling and moving about, people's pens clicking, people making weird noises with their mouths. I couldn't cope. I couldn't focus. And then when you add the fluorescent lights on top of it, I couldn't hear what the teacher was saying, and then I would get picked on by the teacher to then speak about what she had just said, but I couldn't hear what she had just said because of all what was going on. And then I was blamed that I wasn't listening, that I wasn't being attentive, I wasn't paying attention, and that I was just being lazy, not listening, not trying hard enough. It was all
Yeah.
blamed on me. And if we knew why I was struggling, maybe we could put things in place so that I could have maybe learned better at school, maybe had the support that I needed. Maybe I would have been able to have a quiet place I could go to when I needed to decompress, when things got a bit too much, rather than just hiding in the toilets and crying. I think that would have been a lot more better, because I remember when I was younger, I used to end up actually physically unwell due to the amount of stress I was under at school, because my teachers didn't understand me and I wasn't getting the support I needed. As long as we get the right support that we need at school, we get the right understanding, and like the people who are supporting us around me actually try to communicate with us and actually try to ask us, what do you think might help you, or what can we do to help you, and try to include us in conversation, because a lot of the time autistic people aren't included in conversations when it comes to our care sometimes. And I get a bit frustrated about that, because like I want to be included in conversations about my care. Like I am capable of saying what I think I may need and what I think I may need help with. But at first I need to know what help is available for me to then say what I think I may need help with. Because a lot of the time my support team, they often ask me, well, what do you think you need help with? And I'm just like, well, what help is there? And then they won't tell me. I'm like, well, how can I know what I need help with unless I know what support there is that may benefit me? So I think
Yeah.
it's important that we get talked to and know, we get told what help there is, we get given the opportunity to speak and talk. And I think for a lot of autistic people like me who struggle with communication, some autistic people I know, they've been able to use AAC devices quite well, and they found that that's helped them when they're overwhelmed a lot, and it's given them a bit more of a break from communicating verbally, which has helped them have reduce the amount of meltdowns they have, which has been beneficial to them. They can speak, but they prefer to use AAC devices to try and limit the amount of stress they're under and the amount of effort, and you know how much it takes as an autistic person to communicate. It's so hard. It
Yeah.
drains you so much. So for a lot of
Yeah.
autistic people, they found that AAC devices help a lot. And I think if, because I had, when I was in hospital and I was quite distressed, I didn't speak for, I think it was about 3 or 4 days. I couldn't communicate. I couldn't say anything verbally. And they didn't find any sort of communication device to try and help me communicate. I had to communicate via the note section on my iPod back then. And it was very awkward. But as long as we get given the opportunity to be able to have a voice, we get listened to, our views are respected as well, and that we get understood in a way that's a bit more better, and that we just have the support that we need by everybody around me. We can connect with people like us, and we can understand why we are the way we are. And I think it's very important after diagnosis that we get educated about what autism is. We get help to understand our autism and how autism affects us, and that we get help in helping us learn about managing our emotions and about sensory overload and how to prioritize things. Because it wasn't until I was an adult that I learned that I had a choice to prioritize things to reduce how overwhelmed I got, that I could say no. I was
Yeah,
one of
that's
those people
true.
who would, I was one of those people who would say yes to everything. So I wouldn't say no, and I would overload myself. And I didn't like to say no because I was always scared of disappointing people and letting people down. And if I knew that I could say no to protect my own mental health and my own sanity, then things would have been a lot different growing up. And maybe I wouldn't have been admitted into psychiatric hospital as much as I did.
Yeah,
Because
that's
that,
totally relatable. I had the exact same problem to this day. I have such a hard time saying no, and then my plate is just totally overfilled.
we
I
are
wanted
people
to,
pleasers.
yes, definitely. I think that
Literal
comes
people.
from I think that comes from like the stigma though of being rejected so much growing up that then we become eager to please people because we really like strive for and like desire those relationships that we missed out on. At least for me in my experience, I think subconsciously that's probably what's happening. I
Yeah,
wanted
no.
to give you a chance. Sorry, I just want to give you a chance real quick to shout out your social media and shout out where my listeners can basically support you or follow you.
I have a Facebook page called Autistic Truth, and I also have a Twitter page called Autistic Truth, which the Twitter page is Truth Autistic, is the other way around.
And you said you had a coffee or coffee? I don't know how it's pronounced.
Ko-fi coffee, however you spell it, I pronounce it, I don't know. My
Okay, so it's
pronunciation
down there.
isn't great.
It's ko-fi.com/autistic truth for those of you listening in the audio. And again, her Facebook is at Autistic Truth and Twitter is Truth Autistic, correct?
Yeah, but I do think it's also fair that we listen to autistic people's stories who have been through ABA therapy, who haven't had good experiences, and that we listen to both sides of it.
Well, thank you so much for coming here and being willing to have this conversation, especially since we do have a little bit of differing viewpoints. So I think that this is a really good conversation to have. I appreciate you coming here. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great remainder of your day.
Thank you.